The month of April was extremely difficult for me. I have mentioned it in a few other videos that I posted recently, so I won't stop here to talk about it, but it is a fact. And while some people have a difficulty reading when they are in a stressful situation or dealing with something very tough and personal, I am kind of the opposite. I throw myself into reading kind of as a coping mechanism, and so naturally, in April I did very well in terms of reading. The problem is that, for one, I had an already gigantic TBR. I had some leftover books from March, I had my personal TBR game, The Lord of the Reads, and I had a separate TBR for Orilium Spring Equinox, as well as the Buzzword Reading Challenge that goes every month. And in combination with that, whenever I'm dealing with a hard time, I become a little bit more of a mood reader. And so naturally, I wasn't able to read all the books on my TBR. However, I did really well, surprisingly well given the circumstances. First, let's start with the leftover books that I had from March. And the first book is Circe by Madeline Miller. This was a random bookshelf jar pick, and I already started it. However, I never finished it because the nature of this book is such that it focuses on the suffering of a specific person. And while I don't have an issue with suffering in books in general, I find it very often cathartic. In this case, it is so focused on the act of her suffering through the things that happened to her and her experiencing them in her head and in real life that it was becoming a little bit too much. And so I ultimately decided to DNF this book temporarily only. I think it's a good book and I think it has the potential to be a great book, but I think right now is not the best moment for me to be reading this, so I am not gonna finish it right now, and I'm gonna wait until my May TBR is over to re-add it to the bookshelf jar. The next book that I had as a leftover from March was Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. This is a young adult fantasy and the second book in the Six of Crows duology. This was actually a leftover from February, where it was a buddy read pick for me and a friend of mine. And actually, because I had to travel at the end of March, I filmed my wrap-up a little bit early in the month, around the 24th or 25th, and I was able to finish the book before the end of March. And boy, was it a good book. It's full of action and emotion and great plot twists and even better relationships. It started exactly where Six of Crows ended, and I started reading it, I think, around the beginning of the middle of March, and it took me a while to finish it, as you can see, because I wasn't exactly feeling it. It might have been because of the moment where I picked it, or it might have been because I was worried that the entire book is going to focus on one specific thing that happened at the end of Six of Crows. Fortunately, that was resolved somewhat quickly, and then the book changed direction, and I really liked the direction in which it went after that. The story was crafted in such an intricate way that it was impossible not to care. There were multiple peaks both in the plot and in character development, and I was on the edge of my seat repeatedly. And just when I would think that everything is clear, the author would throw me a curveball, and I really like that. I even ended up shedding a tear or two at the end of this book. I gave this book 5 stars, and this duology really elevated my opinion of Leigh Bardugo's writing. I highly recommend it. And the last book that was left over from March was a mood read that I picked up on a whim, and that is Full Moon by Jim Butcher. This is an adult urban fantasy and the second book in the Dresden Files series. I was also able to finish this before the end of March, by the way, and I absolutely love this book. I kind of think of this series as Percy Jackson for grown-ups in a very good way. And while I really liked the first book in this series, I think I enjoyed this one even better, or maybe I was more in the mood for picking it up. Funnily enough, the first book is set in spring and I read it in autumn, and this book is set in autumn and I read it in spring, which I find kind of hilarious. The plot is very well woven and the character work is great. I find myself liking Harry Dresden more and more, but what I think this book does amazingly is the atmosphere. There's just something about it that makes me want to keep reading. It's kind of like a pair of old shoes that you can't stop wearing. It's the perfect book to curl up on the couch with in the evening with a cup of tea. It's just super cozy to me. And what's even better here is that we started seeing threads of the overarching plot for the entire series, and I'm super excited about it. Obviously, I gave the book 5 stars. And now let's go through all the books that were on my April TBR. I'm gonna read them from my reading journal, starting with my Lord of the Reads TBR game. First, we have A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, which was a random bookshelf jar pick. The second one was Castle in the Air by Diana Wynne-Jones, which was a series jar pick. The third one was The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, which was 2023 TBR jar pick. Book number 4 was The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley, which was a random bookshelf jar pick. And book number 5 was The Secret by Julie Garwood, which was another bookshelf jar pick. And for my Orilium TBR, you will see that we have some repeating books because I tried to double up with the books that match the prompt. The first book for Orilium was A Tale of Two Cities again, which was for astronomy, and the prompt was 2-letter E's in the title. The second book for Orilium was And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, which was for conjuration, and the prompt was recommended by a friend. The third book was Promise of Blood by Brian McClellan, which was for demonology, and the prompt was book compared to your favorite. Book number 4 was Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins, which was for inscription, and the prompt was book from your top or highest shelf. Book number 5 was God Killer by Hannah Kaner. It was for lore, and the prompt was book with a map. Book number 6 was The Count of Monte Cristo again, for psionics and divination, and the prompt being clouds on the cover or on the title. And book number 7 was Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Nouvel. Now, obviously, as I already mentioned, I wasn't able to finish all of those books on this list. We're gonna start with the books that I wasn't able to finish. The first one being Castle in the Air by Diana Wynne-Jones. I wasn't feeling like picking it up to begin with, and when I was evaluating and prioritizing which books to actually read, this one was the only one that I don't physically own, and I decided that it wasn't worth it spending money right now when I already have all of these books around me, so I decided to drop it and read it some other time. It will also be added back to the TBR game after the May TBR is completed. And the second and last book that I wasn't able to finish from my TBR was The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley. Now for this one, I don't really have a reason, I wasn't feeling like picking it up. Again, comparing with the other books on this TBR and prioritizing, I felt more like reading the other ones, and I decided to leave this one for another time. It's not a big book, it probably wouldn't have taken me long to read it, but it was the one that I was the least excited about, I think. So yeah, again, I will add it to the TBR game after the May TBR is completed. And now it's finally time to talk about the books I read in April in the order in which I picked them up. Starting with a book that was not only not on my TBR, but is gigantic. And the reason why I picked it up is because the very beginning of April was probably the worst moment, not probably, definitely the worst moment of my life, and I really needed something to help me go through these hard times, something to feel cathartic and restore in me a little bit of hope for life in general. And that book is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. This is an adult epic fantasy and the second book in the Stormlight Archive series. Now, if you've watched any videos on this channel, you already know that I'm a big fan of Brandon Sanderson's writing, and this book specifically is one of those things in life that just makes me look at things in a different way, to look at hardship differently, to face hardship and get out of it a better person. This is what a lot of the philosophy of this book focuses on, and it really helped me get through these terrible days in the beginning of the month. It is a reread for me, and it's a big book, well over 1,000 pages, but it took me almost no time to read it, and I gave it 5 stars again. The next book I picked up was another gigantic one, and that was The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This is the unabridged version. I did not like this book. I had very high expectations. A lot of people have praised it to me, and on top of that, this is a well-renowned and very respected story, and I can understand why. But again, I did not like it. I gave it 2 stars. To be fair, I would probably evaluate this book to be a little over 2 stars, but it was not enough to be 2.5, and Goodreads doesn't give you the opportunity to be more specific, so I decided to go with 2 stars. The book started very promising about this great young guy who suffered unfairly because of the jealousy and envy of bad people. And there were some very powerful scenes, especially in the prison. I was very affected and very excited about what's gonna happen next. And then it turned into this weirdly sadistic story. And mind you, I have no issue with revenge. I think revenge plotlines are some of the more satisfying ones to read. But my focus was not on the revenge because there was so much more around it that was so unnecessary and took so long to even get to the revenge plot lines. But the biggest thing that bothered me was how weirdly sadistic and cruel the Count was towards his friends, the people he was trying to help, and the way that he helped them was disturbing. And I don't want to venture into spoilers here. I'm thinking of making an entirely separate video talking about why I think if you read this book today you won't like it, but you'd probably be wrong to do so, and why I personally didn't like it, and I'll talk more in depth in that video when I have the time to actually film it. I did not enjoy this book. I know that this is probably a controversial statement, and you don't have to try to convince me otherwise. I know that I'm not reading it in the original language that it was published in. I know that it was published as a serial back in the day, not as a whole gigantic book. I understand all of those things. I understand that the sensibilities of the time were different, but my reasons for disliking it don't really have anything to do with those things, and I am sure that I probably would have liked it more had I read it in French. Unfortunately, my French is not as great to allow me to read 1400 pages of a classic, and I think giving honest opinion about books is important, so this is my honest opinion. The next book I picked up was God Killer by Hannah Kaner. This is an adult fantasy and the first book in the God Killer series. It was both on my Orilium TBR and on my 2023 most anticipated releases. I have a full book review for this one, so I'm not gonna stop here to talk too much about it. I gave it 3 stars. It was okay, but I was slightly disappointed, and this is where I'm gonna leave it. Next, I picked up Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Nouvel. This is an adult sci-fi novel and the first book in the Themis Files, and oh my god, was this a great book. It first of all addresses one of my favorite tropes, and that is people finding out and digging out old things that somebody else buried in the ground a long time ago. This book has multiple super interesting characters whom I alternately hated and loved, and one specific one that I passionately hated since the moment she showed up on page. It has a very interesting plot, a lot of mystery, and a lot of action, as well as some good quantity of science in very different areas. But the most unique thing about this book, in my opinion, is the format in which it's written. It is in the form of logs and conversation recording. It's basically all dialogue. And how the author has managed to create such an engaging plot and interesting story with just this formatting, I can't even begin to fathom. I gave this book 5 stars. I loved it all, and I am so excited to continue with the series. Next, I picked up And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. This is a standalone mystery/thriller by the author, and it's a classic and very well known to everybody. It was recommended to me by my friend Bibi, and I am so happy she did so, because man, what a book. This is by far the darkest Agatha Christie story that I have ever read, and I loved it. It is so elaborate and well crafted. It kept me on the edge of my seat. It gave me this sense of dread and sometimes even fear. The mystery and the plot were masterfully developed, and all the characters were so interesting. Their backstories were surprisingly twisting and kept on shocking me throughout the entire book. I changed my mind who the killer was at least 5 times throughout the book, and while I was able to correctly guess who they were pretty early in the book, the author managed to throw me off, and in such an obvious way in hindsight that I really have to tip my hat to her. The only thing that I found slightly far-fetched was the explanation about the getting rid of the gun at the end of the book. It seemed like a really unreliable way to do so, but I guess it's not impossible. I really enjoyed reading this book. I'm so happy I finally did, and I gave it 5 stars. Next, I picked up Promise of Blood by Brian McClellan. This is an adult fantasy and the first book in the Powder Mage series. I'm just gonna say it in the beginning, I gave this book 5 full and well-deserved stars. There were so many things I loved about this book, starting with the world, which was absolutely magnificent, with the mystery about it, with the past, with the present. It was just exquisite. I also loved the plot. It was very intricate and twisted, and it changed directions a few times. But more than anything, I think I loved the characters. We didn't get to know them too well, but we get to know just about enough about every single one that we followed to be able to empathize with them and to understand their motivations and to create intrigue about their personalities as well. As I already mentioned earlier, this was part of my Orilium TBR because it was a book that was compared to a favorite of mine, which was Mistborn. And while this book definitely reminds me of Mistborn, I find myself comparing it more so to the First Law trilogy and the Black Company. I think it is kind of a combination of the 3, with the world and the plot mystery kind of reminding me more about the First Law trilogy, and the setup with the Powder Mages and the Chosen Ones reminding me very much of the Black Company, and with the magic system reminding me very much of Mistborn. Again, gave the book 5 stars, loved it, can't wait to continue in the series. I kind of wish I had the rest of the books here right now so that I can do so, but I do not as of this moment, and hopefully I'll be able to get to them soon. Next, I picked up Mercy by Julie Garwood. This is an adult romantic suspense and the second book in the Buchanan-Renard series, or Renard-Buchanan, I'm not entirely sure what it was. And I gotta tell you, this book is so much fun. What I liked the most about it was the Louisiana setting with the swamps and the little town and the people. Matter of fact, I think the supporting characters really elevated this book to the next level. The backstory of the main characters also got me really excited about them. I think the love interest was very appealing because rarely do I find the men in these types of books as attractive as the author is trying to convince us they are. In this case, I could actually see it, and not just because of physical appearance, but more so because of the character of the person, because of the actions that he took, because of the way he reacted to the things happening around them. And I really like the mystery/thriller plot of this book, way more appealing than the romantic one, mostly because the female main character was, you know what? Julie Garwood has this thing that some of her female protagonists are a little bit of airheads. They're supposedly these very feminine, beautiful, and strong women, but as soon as they see a dude, they turn into this puddle of goo. And in this case, we have a surgeon for a main character, and she is very tough and does the right things always. And as soon as she sees this dude, she turns into this bumbling fool. And I really dislike that. I don't enjoy following these female characters. And mind you, I do understand that people can get flustered around the person that they like. I have also been in that kind of situation. But to this extent, it's extreme in my opinion. Anyway, I gave the book 3.5 stars, and I highly recommend it because I think if you enjoy romantic suspense, you will really enjoy this one. Next, I picked up another Julie Garwood book, and that was The Secret, which is a historical romance and is the first book in the Highlands Lairds. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. It is obviously set up in Scotland, and I really enjoyed this story. It is lovely, if slightly too dreamy love story that features some great friendship, some great romance, and a lovely setting, as well as some adventure. Beware though, the romantic scenes in this book are very explicit, and if that's not your thing, as it is not mine, you might want to kind of skim through them like I did. But if graphic love-making scenes are your thing, this is the one for you. I think you're gonna really enjoy it. I gave the book 4.5 stars. And then I picked up A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This is a very well-known classic. I don't think I need to give you an introduction to it. And what a story it was. I laughed, I cried, I was outraged, I was on the edge of my seat. And more than anything, this story sparked in me a lot of curiosity about 18th century France, because as a Bulgarian, I do not know much about this history. We don't study it that much in school because our own history is full of trials and tribulations, and there's not much time for anything else. I really loved the plot of this story. It was very exciting, but even more than that, I loved the author's writing style. It is so subtle and so masterful. It's truly exquisite. And if there is one thing that this book lacks in, at least at first glance, that is character work. The author just drops these characters in the middle of the action without too much preambles and too much focusing on their character or their quirks. Personally, I do not find this to be a negative because it's my impression that this is not the main point of the story. It is to some degree an action drama, if that is something that you can imagine, and to another, a social commentary. Therefore, the personality of the characters is not as relevant as their unique position in the more global events that are happening and in which they were pulled without their consent. In my opinion, the society itself is the main character of this story, and all the protagonists that we follow are the supporting cast to show us the personality and sensibilities of said society. I was thinking of making maybe a separate video about this book to discuss a little bit more in depth why I find this book to be so unique among all the books that the author has written. I gave it 5 stars. I am so happy I read it. I would recommend it, but beware, this is not a light read to go through in a day, even though the page count is not very significant. I think it will be more beneficial to you to take your time to go through the meaning behind the specific words that have been used by the author in the way in which which they were used. Because trust me, the very famous opening paragraph is not the only infinitely quotable one in this book. And those were the only books that I was able to finish in the month of April. However, I have started 2 others. The first one is Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins. This is a young adult dystopian sci-fi and the third and last book in the Hunger Games trilogy. I started it a few days ago and I'm having a great time with it. I have no doubts that I'll be able to finish it within a day or 2, which will fully complete my Orilium TBR, and it's going to be a success for my character. So far, I'm having a great time with this book and I think it's going to be either 4 or 5 stars. We'll see. I am pretty early in the book, so I wouldn't like to give a final opinion. I will add it to my wrap-up for May with a more detailed review and my final rating. And the other book that I picked up in April, but I'm still currently reading, is The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England, which is the second secret project of Brandon Sanderson. This is an adult fantasy / science fiction, and so far I'm having a good time with it, but I wouldn't call it one of my favorite Sanderson's works. Still, I am less than halfway through, so I will refrain from giving full opinion for it, and you will see my review and rating in May. So as a total, I read 11 books in April and I wasn't able to finish 2 of the books on my TBR. I think this is a great success, but I would like to say something here. Reading this amount of book consistently is first of all not sustainable, but also I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, because going so quickly through books often doesn't leave you enough time to think through them and to pay attention to the little details. And I know this about myself this month. Although I enjoyed the vast majority of the books that I read, if not pretty much all of them, I think I would have been able to get more of those books had I taken my time to go slowly through each one of those. However, I am not sorry I did this, because I didn't do it to try to achieve some goal. Obviously, I was happy to be able to achieve some goal, but I did it because this was something I really needed for myself. In my personal opinion, if you read 1 book this month or 2 books this month, you already succeeded tremendously. And if something was left in your mind afterwards or in your heart, if you found your new favorite book, or if you learned something from these books, you already achieved more than anybody could want. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you read in the month of April. I'd be really curious to hear about it. Did you participate in Orilium? Have you read any of the books that I talked about, and what you thought about them? Thank you so much for watching. And if you'd like to see some of my other wrap-ups, you can check out this playlist. Bye!